They laughed when she stepped off the wagon. But by sundown, every man on that ranch would realize they had been standing on his land the whole time. The stagecoach wheels rolled away in a cloud of pale Texas dust, leaving Eleanor Whitmore alone at the edge of Red Hollow Ranch with one scuffed leather suitcase and a folded letter offering her work at $12 a month plus room and board. The sun hung high and merciless, the kind of August heat that baked the prairie flat and hard for miles in every direction, and the wind carried the dry scent of cattle and sun-warmed wood. She stood barely 5 feet 4, bonnet pinned tight against the gusts, gray traveling dress pressed and mended at the seams with careful hands that had learned thrift the hard way. A few yards off, a line of cowboys leaned against the fence rail, hats tipped low, boots crossed at the ankle, watching as if the ranch had just been delivered a crate of china instead of a cook. One of them let out a low whistle. Another muttered something about how long she would last before the first roundup dusted her clean back to town. Eleanor did not answer. She had buried a husband, sold the last of her furniture for train fare, and ridden 200 miles west with nothing but the promise of honest work. A handful of idle remarks from men who smelled of leather and sweat would not undo her. The ranch house loomed behind them, wide porch shaded by a sagging roof, its white paint faded to the color of bone. Somewhere beyond the barns, a herd shifted and stirred, the steady thud of hooves traveling through the ground like a heartbeat. Clyde Mercer, the foreman, stepped forward at last, suspenders stretched over a broad chest, mustache trimmed sharp as if authority could be worn on the lip. He looked her over from bonnet to boots, not cruel, not kind, simply measuring. "You cook?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied, voice steady as fence wire. "For how many?" He gestured to the men behind him. 30 during drive season. 20 when we're light." She nodded once as if he had said 3. It was then that she noticed another man standing apart from the others near the water trough, sleeves rolled, hat pulled low, saying nothing. Dust clung to his shirt like it belonged there, and his hands were as rough as any laborer's. But he watched her not with amusement, not with doubt, just quiet attention. When Clyde turned to bark orders about where she would sleep and when she would rise, 4:30 sharp, before the first branding fire ever sparked, this silent cowboy did not laugh with the rest. He only straightened slightly, as if something unseen had just shifted. Eleanor picked up her suitcase and followed the foreman toward the kitchen door, the boards creaking under each step, unaware that the man by the trough had signed every deed on that property and that before the week was through, the balance of power at Red Hollow Ranch would tilt not with gunfire or shouting, but with a single sentence spoken at the right table at the right time. The kitchen at Red Hollow Ranch was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, barely 15 feet across with 2 narrow windows that let in more glare than breeze, and a cast-iron stove that looked as if it had outlived 3 owners and a handful of hard winters. She set her suitcase down beside a scarred oak table and ran her palm across the surface, feeling the grooves cut by years of careless knives and impatient plates. This would be her kingdom, whether the men outside respected it or not. Clyde Mercer stood in the doorway with his thumbs hooked into his suspenders, explaining the rules as though he were reciting scripture. Breakfast at 5 sharp. Biscuits enough for every man to take 2. Coffee strong enough to stand a spoon upright. No complaints about dust, no extra sugar unless he approved it. The cook eats last, he added, as if it were a law written into the deed of the land itself. Eleanor nodded once, not submissive, not defiant, simply listening. She had learned long ago that survival did not always require argument. It required endurance. By 4:30 the next morning, she was awake in the narrow room off the pantry, the thin mattress pressing against her ribs, the air already warm despite the early hour. She tied her apron tight and stepped barefoot across the cool wooden floor, striking a match that flared sulfur bright before catching the stove's waiting kindling. Soon the kitchen filled with the steady rhythm of work, flour dust rising like pale smoke, dough folding under her hands, bacon sizzling in its own fat with a sound that echoed like distant rain on tin. Outside, she heard boots on gravel, low voices, the metallic clink of spurs. The ranch woke in layers, first the cattle shifting in the pasture, then the horses stamping in their stalls, then the men clearing their throats as if the day itself demanded strength from their lungs. When the first cowboy stepped through the door, he paused, surprised by the smell of fresh bread and brewed coffee thick enough to carry across 10 yards of open yard. Others followed, quieter than the afternoon before. Plates filled quickly, biscuits split clean and steaming. No one spoke directly to her, but no one laughed either. At the far end of the table, the quiet man from the trough took his seat without ceremony. Samuel Hayes kept his hat beside his plate and bowed his head for a brief moment before eating, a habit that felt older than the ranch itself. Eleanor noticed the way two of the younger hands waited for him to reach before they did, subtle as a breath, almost invisible. Clyde barked about fence repairs and cattle counts, but Samuel did not compete with the volume. He ate steadily, watching the room the way a surveyor studies lines on a map. When a ranch hand reached for a third biscuit, Clyde slapped the table with his palm and reminded him that rations were not charity. The room tightened. Samuel's fork paused in midair, then continued as if nothing had happened. Eleanor served the last plate and stepped back, hands lightly dusted in flour, aware that she was standing in a room full of men who believed she belonged at the edge of it. She did not yet understand that the man who had said nothing held the power to redraw every line in that house, including the one that kept her eating after everyone else. By the third morning, Eleanor Whitmore understood the rhythm of Red Hollow Ranch the way a musician learns the beat of a drum without ever seeing it struck. The wind arrived first, sliding across the prairie in long, invisible waves that rattled the loose hinge on the back door and carried the scent of mesquite and distant water. Then came the cattle, low and restless beyond the split-rail fence, followed by the men who moved with stiff shoulders and sunburned necks, already tired before the day had properly begun. She had risen at 4 again, sleeves rolled, hair pinned tight, setting out tin plates in straight lines as if order on a table might encourage order in the world beyond it. Clyde Mercer entered with the same authority he wore like a second coat, glancing at the stove as though inspecting a soldier before parade. He lifted a biscuit, broke it in half, studied the steam, then gave a curt nod that passed for approval. The younger hands took their seats quickly, careful not to test his patience. Samuel Hayes arrived last, boots dusty, hat brim casting a quiet shadow across his eyes. He washed his hands at the basin without speaking, the water running clear over calloused fingers, and for a brief second Eleanor noticed something different in the way the others shifted when he moved past them. It was subtle, the way a field bends before a coming storm, not from fear, but from recognition of force. Breakfast unfolded without laughter that morning. A ranch hand named Daniel Griggs reached for the sugar bowl, and Clyde snapped that sweet coffee made soft men. Daniel withdrew his hand at once. Eleanor felt the room tighten again, felt the unspoken rule pressing against her ribs. When she set a plate before Samuel, he looked up and said quietly, "Thank you, Mayam." The words were simple, common as dust, yet they carried weight in that kitchen. No one else had spoken to her that way. She returned to the stove and poured the last of the coffee into a chipped white mug, meaning to leave it for herself later. Clyde noticed. "The cook eats after the men," he reminded her, voice flat and public. Eleanor met his gaze for a moment, not challenging, not shrinking, simply steady. She set the mug back down beside the pot. Samuel's fork paused again, just for a breath. He did not look at Clyde. He did not look at her. He only resumed eating, but something in the room shifted, small as a hinge turning on old wood. After the meal, the men filed out toward the corrals, the sound of boots fading into open air. Samuel lingered long enough to carry his own plate to the wash basin, an act so quiet it almost escaped notice. Clyde frowned, but said nothing. Eleanor stood alone in the doorway for a moment, watching the ranch stretch out across nearly 2,000 acres of sunburned grass and weathered fences, unaware that the man who had thanked her with such simple courtesy held the authority to redraw every custom she had just been ordered to follow, and that before long. The rule about who ate first would not belong to Clyde Mercer at all. By late afternoon, the sun pressed down like a heavy hand on the back of the ranch, turning the wide yard into a shimmer of heat and dust that rose in slow spirals around the hitching posts. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the long wooden table kneading bread for supper, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, flour tracing pale lines across her skin. The kitchen windows were open but offered little relief, only the distant sound of cattle shifting and the steady hammer of someone repairing fence along the south pasture. She had begun to measure time not by a clock, but by footsteps, by the pattern of voices that drifted in and out with the light. Clyde Mercer entered without knocking, boots leaving dry prints across her freshly swept floor. He carried a ledger tucked beneath his arm and wore the same look he had worn each day, as if the ranch were balanced on his shoulders alone. He told her there would be guests for supper, 2 buyers riding in from Wichita Falls to discuss a shipment scheduled before the first frost. The meal needed to be worthy of the land, he said, as though the land were his to defend. Eleanor listened, nodding once, already calculating pounds of beef, pounds of potatoes, how far her stores would stretch. When Clyde left, she stepped outside to the smokehouse and nearly collided with Samuel Hayes standing in the shade of the barn. He held a coil of rope in one hand, hat tipped back just enough to reveal eyes the color of weathered cedar. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them carried the scent of hay and sun-warmed leather. He glanced toward the house, then back at her flour-dusted hands. "If you need extra firewood tonight," he said quietly, "there is dry cedar stacked behind the east shed. It burns clean." She thanked him, surprised he had noticed something so small. Most men noticed only what stood in front of them. As she turned to go, she saw Daniel Griggs leading a bay mare toward the trough and lowering his head respectfully when Samuel passed. It was not obedience. It was recognition. Supper came with the sky streaked orange and violet, the prairie stretching endless beyond the fence line. Eleanor carried platters out herself, setting roasted beef and fresh bread before the buyers, who spoke loudly about acreage and profit margins. Clyde answered their questions with confidence, sharpened by ambition. Samuel took a seat near the far end of the table, not at the head, not beside the buyers, simply among the men. Yet when one of the visitors asked who had overseen the North Pasture improvements that summer, the room hesitated before turning its eyes toward him. He gave a modest answer, short and precise, mentioning rainfall totals and grazing rotation as if he had walked every acre himself. The buyers listened carefully, more carefully than they had listened to Clyde. Eleanor felt the shift without fully understanding it, the subtle rebalancing of weight at the table. She moved quietly between plates, aware that she stood in a house where authority did not always sit where it appeared to sit, and that before the harvest moon rose full above Red Hollow Ranch, the truth of who commanded those 2,000 acres would no longer remain hidden behind dust and denim. The buyers stayed the night, their horses tied along the main rail, their laughter drifting across the yard long after the plates had been cleared and stacked to dry. Eleanor Whitmore washed the last of the supper dishes in water that had long since lost its warmth, the moonlight slipping through the kitchen window in a pale silver band across the floorboards. Outside, crickets stitched a steady rhythm into the dark, and somewhere beyond the pasture fence a coyote called once, then fell silent. She could still hear Clyde Mercer's voice from earlier in the evening, smooth and certain as he spoke of expansion, of adding another 500 acres before spring, of hiring more hands once contracts were signed. He had spoken as though the land answered to him alone. Yet when the older buyer with the iron-gray beard had asked about the deed transfer filed 3 years prior, Clyde's answer had been brief, almost dismissive, and the man's eyes had shifted down the table towards Samuel Hayes without meaning to. That glance had not escaped Eleanor. She had noticed how Samuel held himself through the entire exchange, neither claiming nor deflecting credit, simply allowing the conversation to bend where it naturally would. After the guests retired to the spare rooms upstairs, Samuel remained on the porch, seated in a straight-backed chair facing the open prairie. Eleanor stepped out quietly to empty a pail of wash water near the garden patch and found him there, hat resting on his knee, sleeves still rolled from the day's labor. The air had cooled to something almost gentle, the heat of afternoon replaced by a thin autumn promise. "You worked hard tonight," he said without turning his head. She replied that feeding hungry men was easier than convincing them to listen. A faint smile touched his mouth. "Some men listen more than they speak," he answered. She studied his profile in the moonlight, the calm in it, the absence of the restless ambition she had seen in Clyde's eyes. For a ranch hand, he carried himself with unusual ease, as though he had nothing to prove and nothing to borrow. Before she could ask what he meant, the front door creaked open and Clyde stepped onto the porch, suspender straps dark against his shirt. He reminded her sharply that the kitchen needed to be ready before sunrise, and that guests expected punctual service. The words were not shouted, but they were meant to place her back in her assigned square. Samuel rose slowly from his chair, not confronting, not challenging, only standing. The movement alone quieted the porch. Clyde hesitated for half a second, then adjusted his tone, adding that the buyers were particular men. Eleanor nodded and returned inside, carrying with her the sense that the ranch did not revolve where it appeared to revolve. Behind her, the porch boards creaked again as Samuel resumed his seat, eyes fixed on the dark horizon that stretched across nearly 2,000 acres, land that waited patiently for the moment its true steward would decide it was time to speak. The morning after the buyers departed arrived with a brittle edge in the air, the first true hint that summer was loosening its grip on the plains. Eleanor Whitmore was already at the stove before the eastern sky had fully lightened, the faint gray of dawn stretching over the pastures like a worn blanket. She moved with quiet efficiency, measuring oats into a pot, slicing salt pork thin to make it last, calculating how to stretch provisions now that talk of expansion had stirred expectations across the ranch. Outside, the yard carried a different tone. The men spoke in lower voices, the echo of business discussions lingering like dust that refused to settle. Clyde Mercer entered the kitchen with the ledger tucked firmly beneath his arm, his expression tight, as though numbers had not aligned in his favor. He announced that rations would be reduced until further notice, that coffee grounds were to be used twice before being discarded, that no extra portions would be tolerated. His words were delivered to the room, but his eyes settled on Eleanor as if she were the hinge upon which thrift depended. She listened without protest, though she knew the portions had already been modest. When the men filed in, she served carefully measured bowls, aware of their hunger, aware of the thin line between discipline and resentment. Daniel Griggs glanced toward Samuel Hayes before accepting his plate, a small reflex that did not go unnoticed. Samuel took his seat near the middle of the table, not at its head, yet the space around him felt steadier than anywhere else in the room. Clyde began outlining new work assignments, instructing 2 hands to inspect the north fence line and another to prepare the far pasture for additional cattle. Samuel listened, then asked a quiet question about the water level in the western troughs, mentioning the drop he had observed near the cedar break. The remark was precise, informed, and it caused 2 of the older hands to nod in agreement. Clyde hesitated before responding, as though surprised the matter had been raised without his prompting. Eleanor placed a plate before Samuel and caught the briefest exchange of glances between the men at the table, something unspoken passing through them like a current. After breakfast, as the men stepped out into the pale gold of early light, she carried a crate of onions toward the root cellar and found Samuel near the barn examining a length of fencing wire. He asked if she had enough flour for the week. She admitted that supplies would run tight if numbers increased. He nodded slowly, as if confirming a thought already formed, and said that a delivery from town would arrive by Friday whether or not it had been ordered. The certainty in his voice was not boastful. It was matter of fact, as though he were speaking about the rising of the sun. Eleanor watched him walk toward the pasture, boots steady in the dust, and felt again that quiet imbalance beneath the surface of Red Hollow Ranch, a sense that decisions were being shaped beyond Clyde Mercer's ledger, and that the moment when hidden authority would step fully into daylight was drawing closer with every measured breath of autumn wind. Friday arrived beneath a sky the color of worn steel, thin clouds stretching long and low over the prairie, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Eleanor Whitmore had risen before dawn again, measuring the last of the flour into a wooden bowl and calculating how many biscuits she could shape without leaving the barrel empty. The reduction in rations had already tightened the mood across the ranch. Men spoke less freely, laughter replaced by the scrape of chairs and the dull clink of tin cups set down too firmly. Clyde Mercer entered with the ledger under his arm as always, reminding everyone that thrift was a virtue and waste a weakness. His eyes flicked toward the pantry shelves, counting what remained as though the numbers belonged solely to him. Outside, hoofbeats sounded along the dirt road leading from town, steady and deliberate. Eleanor paused at the window, wiping her hands on her apron. A supply wagon rolled through the gate, stacked with sacks of flour, crates of beans, coffee in sealed tins, and even a small barrel of molasses. The driver tipped his hat and called out that the order had been confirmed and prepaid. Clyde stepped forward sharply, insisting that no such order had been authorized through him. The driver unfolded a folded paper from his coat pocket and read the name written clearly across the top. Several of the ranch hands shifted their weight, glancing toward the barn as if instinctively seeking direction. Samuel Hayes emerged from the far side of the yard, walking with the same unhurried pace he carried each day, boots brushing dust from the path. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain himself. He simply approached the wagon, checked the seal on one of the flour sacks, and thanked the driver for making the trip before the first cold snap. Clyde demanded to know who had approved the expense, his tone edged with frustration rather than authority. Samuel looked at him evenly and replied that the ranch would not tighten its belt at the cost of fairness, that men who worked from sunrise to sunset deserved a full plate, and that the cook should not be forced to measure dignity in ounces. The words were calm, spoken without spectacle, yet they carried across the yard with unmistakable weight. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the scent of bacon drifting behind her, watching as Daniel Griggs and two others stepped forward to unload the wagon without waiting for further instruction. No one announced a change. No declaration was made. Yet the balance shifted in plain daylight. Clyde's grip on the ledger tightened, but he did not countermand the unloading. He could not. As the sacks were carried inside and stacked neatly against the pantry wall, Eleanor felt something steady settle within her, like a foundation reinforced beneath a house long exposed to wind. Samuel brushed the dust from his hands and met her gaze briefly, offering no smile, only acknowledgement. The ranch yard resumed its rhythm, but the air had altered, clearer somehow, as if a quiet line had been drawn that morning, not in anger, not in defiance, but in simple recognition of who truly held the reins at Red Hollow Ranch. The days that followed carried a new undercurrent, subtle but undeniable, like a river changing course beneath a frozen surface. Eleanor Whitmore felt it first in the kitchen, where the shelves now stood full again, sacks of flour stacked firm against the wall, coffee tins aligned in neat rows that promised warmth through the coming cold. She worked with steadier hands, no longer measuring each scoop as though it might be her last. Outside, the men moved with a different kind of quiet, not tense as before, but attentive. Word traveled fast on open land, and though no proclamation had been made, everyone understood who had arranged the delivery and who had not. Clyde Mercer kept the ledger closer than ever, his authority sharpened at the edges, as if precision alone could restore the balance he believed had tilted. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in long strokes of amber and smoke, Clyde announced a new directive before supper. All staff, he said, would adhere strictly to rank at the table. Guests first, then senior hands, then the rest. The cook would continue to eat after all others had finished. His tone was firm, meant to reassert structure. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beef stew rich with carrots and onions, the aroma filling the room with something close to comfort. She did not look up, but she felt every eye flick briefly in her direction. Samuel Hayes entered last, dust lining the crease of his sleeves, hat removed, as always before crossing the threshold. He listened without interruption as Clyde spoke, then took his seat midway down the table. Plates were passed, bowls filled. Conversation began in low murmurs. When Eleanor moved to retreat toward the kitchen door, preparing to wait until the last chair scraped back, Samuel set his spoon down with a soft, deliberate sound against tin. The room quieted not because he demanded it, but because it happened naturally. He rose to his feet, not hurried, not theatrical, and walked toward the empty chair near the head of the table that had remained unused since the buyers departed. Without raising his voice, he asked Eleanor to bring her own plate and sit. Clyde objected at once, reminding him of established order. Samuel turned to face him fully, the late light from the window outlining his frame in gold. Order, he said evenly, exists to protect dignity, not to diminish it. He then placed his hand on the back of the head chair and remained standing. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument. One by one, the men lowered their eyes or nodded almost imperceptibly. Daniel Griggs shifted his seat, creating space. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before setting a modest portion on her plate and stepping forward. She did not sit at the head, nor did Samuel. Instead, he guided her to the middle of the table and resumed his place beside her. Clyde remained standing longer than necessary, ledger pressed against his chest, but he said nothing further. Supper resumed, the clink of utensils returning in cautious rhythm. Outside, the wind moved across nearly 2,000 acres of grass, bending it in the same direction, as if the land itself recognized the quiet correction unfolding within its boundaries. The morning after she took her place at the table did not explode into argument or spectacle. It unfolded in a silence so precise it felt deliberate. Eleanor Whitmore rose before first light as she always had, yet something in her step carried less weight, as if an unseen burden had been set down during the night. The prairie stretched pale and endless beyond the kitchen window, a low mist clinging to the far fence line, while the eastern sky warmed by degrees. She measured coffee into the pot without counting twice, trusting there would be enough. When the men entered, boots tracking in thin lines of dust, they did not hesitate at the doorway. Daniel Griggs nodded to her directly. Another hand muttered a quiet good morning. Small words, almost lost in the scrape of chairs, but they landed with quiet certainty. Clyde Mercer arrived last, ledger tucked beneath his arm, jaw set in a line that had grown sharper with each passing day. He surveyed the room as if searching for disorder he could correct. Finding none, he announced that a representative from the county land office would be visiting before noon to review updated boundary filings and grazing rights. The statement hung in the air longer than it should have. Several of the older hands exchanged brief glances. Samuel Hayes continued pouring his coffee, steady and unhurried. He asked only what time the representative was expected. Clyde answered curtly, adding that all documentation would be handled through him, as foreman and acting authority of operations. The phrase sounded rehearsed. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full sweep of nearly 2,000 acres rolling outward in patient silence. Around mid-morning, a single rider approached from the south road, dust rising behind him in a thin trail. Eleanor stepped onto the porch with a basket of freshly baked bread cooling against a cloth, watching as the rider dismounted and greeted the men gathered near the hitching rail. Papers were removed from a leather satchel, seals visible even from a distance. Clyde stepped forward immediately, voice measured but firm, explaining improvements, expansions, projected yields. The county representative listened politely, then asked to confirm the signature authority listed on the most recent deed revision. For the first time, the yard grew completely still. Even the wind seemed to pause along. The fence posts. Samuel stepped forward only when the question remained unanswered. He removed his hat, nodded once to the representative, and accepted the folded document handed toward him. His signature moved across the page with calm familiarity. No flourish, no announcement, just ink pressed into paper that had long carried his name. The county man thanked him directly and spoke of future filings needing his approval. Clyde's ledger remained clutched against his chest, unopened. Eleanor stood in the doorway, flowers still dusting her apron, and watched the truth settle into the yard without a single raised voice. It did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like sunrise, steady and undeniable, illuminating what had been there all along while the prairie, wide and patient, bore quiet witness. The county rider left before the sun reached its highest point, his horse cutting a narrow line through the tall grass as he headed back toward town with the signed documents secured in his satchel. Dust settled slowly in his wake, drifting down across the yard as if the land itself were absorbing what had just been made visible. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the porch rail, the warmth of midday pressing against her shoulders, and watched the men return to their tasks with a quiet awareness that nothing would look quite the same again. Samuel Hayes did not linger at the center of attention. He handed the pen back to the county representative earlier without ceremony and had already walked toward the north pasture, discussing fence repairs with Daniel Griggs as though the morning had been routine. Clyde Mercer remained near the hitching post longer than necessary, ledger tucked beneath his arm, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the barn. The authority he had worn so confidently now appeared narrower, defined by responsibility rather than ownership. By late afternoon, the sky shifted to a softer blue, streaked with high white clouds that promised a cooler evening. Eleanor prepared supper with deliberate calm, slicing fresh bread from the new flour shipment, stirring a pot of beans seasoned with salt pork and a measure of molasses that had been impossible only days before. The aroma drifted through the open windows, carried across the yard where the men gathered tools and wiped sweat from their brows. When the dinner bell rang, it sounded the same as it always had, yet its echo carried a different weight. The men entered without hesitation, taking their seats with a natural ease that no longer felt forced into rank. Clyde stepped inside and paused, as if uncertain where to stand. Samuel was already at the table, not at the head, not claiming prominence, simply present. Before anyone spoke, he looked toward Clyde and gestured to the chair nearest the end. "There is work to be done tomorrow," he said evenly, "and it will take all of us." The statement was neither reprimand nor apology. It was acknowledgement. Clyde hesitated, then took the seat offered, setting his ledger down beside his plate for the first time in days. Eleanor served each man in turn, and when she reached Samuel, their eyes met briefly in the lamplight. No triumph rested there, only steadiness. As she moved to step back toward the stove, Samuel spoke clearly enough for the room to hear. "The cook will eat with us, as she has earned." No one objected, not because they feared him, but because the truth of it had already taken root. Eleanor set her plate down and sat among them, the lamplight casting long golden lines across the wooden table. Outside, the wind moved gently through nearly 2,000 acres of grass, bending it not by force, but by quiet agreement with the direction it had always been meant to follow. Autumn settled over the ranch with a quiet certainty, cool mornings giving way to clear afternoons that stretched long across the open range. The change in air seemed to mirror the change within the house itself. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the kitchen with calm assurance, her steps no longer measured by caution but by purpose. The shelves were stocked, the stove steady, and the rhythm of meals had become something close to harmony. The men entered each day with respectful nods rather than sideways glances. Even laughter had returned, softer now, less edged with mockery. Clyde Mercer kept to his duties with visible effort, overseeing fence repairs and cattle counts, but his voice no longer filled every corner of the yard. Authority had shifted from declaration to example, and the difference could be felt like the difference between a storm and a steady rain. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast amber light across the porch boards, Samuel Hayes stood near the rail studying the western pasture. Eleanor stepped outside to shake flour. From her apron, the fine white dust drifting away in the breeze. For a moment they stood side by side without speaking, watching a small group of cattle move slowly toward water. Clyde emerged from the barn carrying the ledger, hesitating before approaching them. His shoulders no longer carried the sharp tension of rivalry. He cleared his throat and addressed Samuel directly, acknowledging that boundary revisions would require coordination before winter set in. The words were formal, careful, stripped of pride. Samuel listened, nodding once, and replied that the ranch would move forward together, that good land required steady hands and clear judgment, not ownership spoken too loudly. There was no accusation in his tone, only expectation. Clyde lowered the ledger slightly, as though its weight had lessened. Inside, the dinner table was set as always, lamplight glowing warm against the wooden walls. When the bell rang, the men gathered without hesitation. Eleanor took her seat among them as naturally as any other, the chair no longer symbolic, but simply hers. Conversation flowed around grazing plans and winter feed, practical matters shaped by cooperation rather than command. Samuel remained in the middle of the table, neither elevated nor withdrawn, his presence firm without spectacle. As plates emptied and the evening quieted, a sense of balance settled over the room, steady as the prairie beyond the windows. Outside, nearly 2,000 acres stretched beneath a sky turning deep blue, the first stars beginning to show. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, bending it in unison, not from force but from shared direction. And in that quiet house, without announcement or ceremony, the ranch had found its true center, not in the loudest voice, but in the one that chose dignity over display and steadiness over pride. The first true cold front rolled in just after midnight, slipping across the prairie with a dry northern wind that rattled the shutters and carried the scent of distant frost. By dawn a thin silver crust lay over the water troughs, and breath rose in pale clouds from both men and cattle alike. Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto the porch wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the horizon glow faint pink beyond the far fence line. Nearly 2,000 acres stretched outward, touched by the fragile stillness that comes only before winter claims the land in earnest. Inside the kitchen, the stove burned steady and bright, fueled by cedar stacked carefully behind the east shed as Samuel had once mentioned. She moved with practiced confidence, setting biscuits to rise, stirring oatmeal thick enough to warm a man from the inside out. The ranch hands entered stamping cold from their boots, nodding to her without hesitation, taking their places with quiet familiarity. Clyde Mercer arrived carrying the ledger, but set it down beside the door rather than holding it at his chest. That small gesture did not go unnoticed. Samuel Hayes followed soon after, his coat dusted with frost, eyes clear and thoughtful. He paused near the doorway long enough to study the yard, as if measuring the season ahead. When he took his seat, he did not claim the head of the table. He never had. Eleanor brought out the first platter and set it down. Before she could retreat to the stove, Samuel spoke evenly, suggesting that winter shifts be rotated so no man bore the longest nights alone and that additional firewood be cut before the next front arrived. The suggestion was practical, not commanding, yet every man listened. Clyde nodded slowly and added that he would adjust the schedule accordingly. There was no tension in his voice now, only acceptance of shared purpose. As breakfast continued, plans formed naturally around the table, shaped by cooperation rather than decree. Afterward, the men stepped outside into the brittle morning light, their boots crunching softly against frozen ground. Eleanor lingered at the doorway, watching Samuel walk the fence line with Daniel, pointing toward the low dip near the cedar break where snow might drift deepest. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man who understood both land and people, who knew that strength did not require display. The wind swept across the open range, bending tall grass that had not yet fully surrendered to frost. In that movement there was no resistance, only agreement with the seasons turning. And within the ranch house, warmed by steady fire and steadier hands, the order of things had settled into its rightful place, not through argument, not through humiliation, but through a quiet choice to honor dignity above pride. The cold would test them all in the weeks ahead, yet the foundation beneath that wide prairie had been set firm, invisible but unshakable, like a deed signed long before anyone thought to question who held the pen. Winter settled fully over the ranch before anyone marked the exact day it arrived. Snow did not fall in a storm that demanded attention. It came in quiet layers, thin at first, then steady, covering the prairie in a pale sheet that softened fences and blurred the far cedar break into a single white horizon. Nearly 2,000 acres rested under that silence, the land no longer brown and restless, but calm and waiting. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the kitchen window one early morning, watching Samuel Hayes cross the yard with a coil of rope over his shoulder, his breath rising in slow clouds against the cold. The barn doors opened and closed in rhythm. The cattle fed before sunrise, the troughs broken free of ice with patient effort rather than force. Inside, the stove burned hot and reliable, cedar snapping clean in the firebox. The long table was already set when the men entered, boots dusted with snow instead of dirt, hats removed with quiet habit. No one paused at the doorway anymore. No one measured rank before taking a seat. Clyde Mercer stepped in carrying the ledger as he always had, but he set it down without holding it like a shield. He spoke of feed counts and fence lines in need of watching once the thaw came, and when he finished, he looked to Samuel not for permission, but for confirmation. Samuel listened, nodding once, offering a measured thought about conserving hay through February and rotating night watch so no man stood alone in the cold too long. His voice carried no demand. It did not need to. Eleanor brought out platters of biscuits and thick slices of ham, placing them within reach of every hand. When she sat, it was not an invitation extended by another. It was simply her place. Conversation moved easily, shaped by shared labor rather than pride. After breakfast, the men filed out into the bright winter light, their figures small against the wide white field. Samuel lingered a moment on the porch, glancing back toward the kitchen where Eleanor cleared the table. Their eyes met across the doorway, no words exchanged, only the steady understanding of what had been restored without spectacle. Beyond the house, the wind swept gently across the frozen grass, bending it in a single direction, not from force, but from agreement with the season. Authority no longer echoed through shouted commands or ledger pages pressed to a chest. It lived in quiet decisions, in full plates set before hungry men, in chairs shared rather than withheld. The ranch stood firm against the cold not because one voice claimed it, but because dignity had been given room to sit at the table. And out there, beneath a sky stretched wide and clear above the snow-covered plains, justice did not arrive on horseback or with thunder. It arrived softly, like winter itself, steady and undeniable, settling into place and staying.